You know, it was appealing because we thought that we could get the newspaper back into the black and make money. The problem was the Gazette was so much further ahead of us that they just continued to gain market share. They continued to gain advertising, continued to gain circulation, even though we were having great luck in reducing our costs, and we reduced our costs significantly. We couldn't reduce them enough to make a profit.
The Gazette had remarkably more resources, and so we tended to be sort of the leading paper. Certainly we were in terms of the amount of circulation we had and the amount of advertising we had.
Well, we never worried about the Democrats' competition. We were a morning paper, they were an afternoon paper. We thought we were better, of course.
When he first bought the paper, I think there was a feeling on the part of a lot of the old-time Gazette people that he didn't constitute a threat. There were some old-timers who laughed at the notion that somebody associated with the old Palmer newspaper chain could compete with the great Arkansas Gazette.
I was just a 23-year-old kid in the newsroom, and all the old hands were fairly contemptuous.
The Gazette was a highly principled newspaper and unafraid, and morale was extremely high.
Well, Arkansas had a dearth of respected and historic institutions, and the Arkansas Gazette was both.
We were always the more responsible paper and the more aggressive paper.
And the Gazette was patterned after the New York Times. You know, the columns looked the same, it was gray, it was distinguished, had a very good reputation.
The lead better tell you who, what, where, why, and when.
Well, the Gazette had always been viewed as a paper of record, so-called. We were fairly serious, fairly boring, stodgy.
We prided ourselves on covering everything. I mean, the entire state, all of state government. A story in the Gazette might have been back on page B5 or whatever, and would generate more reaction, comment, etc., than a story that might have been page 1 in the Democrat. But no, we were clearly the gray old lady, and proud of it.
That's when Walter Hussman approached the Gazette on the idea of a joint operating agreement, which is when newspapers share printing and perhaps even advertising facilities and have separate news staffs to save money.
So at this point, you know, we probably ought to give up. And so that's when we went to the Pattersons and the Gazette and said, you know, we thought we could, you know, operate the paper profitably. We couldn't. We're willing to give up. We're willing to let you have 90+% of the profits. Just do a JOA under whatever terms you dictate. We'll still put out a second newspaper in the market. It'll be the #2 newspaper.
Well, the Gazette ownership didn't want to do it. I think that was a serious mistake.
Of course, they turned that down, and you know, it's kind of hard to criticize them for turning it down, I guess, at this point, because they perceived correctly that the Democrat was on its last leg.
He realized, as I think we did, that there was just no way an afternoon newspaper was going to succeed.
And I really think they thought the best thing for the Gazette would be just to see the Democrat go out of business.
He sought the joint operating agreement before he went morning. When he saw that he couldn't get a guaranteed share of the market, however small, as an evening paper, he decided to go for broke, switch the paper for morning and compete head up.
And we just kind of said, you know, before we close the newspaper, let's take one last look at this and see if there's anything that could be done to salvage it. And so I looked all over the country, and I didn't find very much to encourage me, but I did find a few places. One of them I found was in Dallas, where they dropped the afternoon edition and put the morning edition out in the state, and their circulation had gone up, and they'd done a lot better. And so it was sort of okay, why don't we do that? And if we fail, we feel a lot better about failing. We can at least say we tried everything.
When he went morning, I think that stepped up people's concern because clearly he was serious and he was prepared to invest a lot of money.
In the newsroom, we were not at all concerned. We never had been. We saw no reason to be.
I think still probably the predominant feeling on the staff is that what possibly could harm the old Arkansas Gazette.
That was a really gutsy, brave move he made.
Like a poker player does who makes an incredible bluff and an incredible bet. He's got to be given credit for putting it on the table, pushing the pile of chips up.
He came to work for us in late '78, about 2 months before we announced that we were going to put out a morning edition, before we announced free want ads, before we announced we were going to put out a bigger news hole with more news than the Gazette. So he came in about 60 days prior to that to help in some of the planning and getting ready for that. I knew that Bob was really an ideal person for what we needed, and I really needed him. One, he knew Arkansas. He had been here most of his career. He had been the AP bureau chief. He'd spent most of his life in Little Rock. That was real important. Number two, he was really sold on objectivity. He did not want the news columns to have any slant whatsoever to him. Bob was a tough competitor. He's the kind of guy that didn't like to get beat. He had a real competitive spirit about him. Did I know I was going to hire somebody that was going to turn into being a 7-day-a-week columnist? No. Did I know I was going to turn into, that Bob was going to develop this persona and this reputation in Arkansas that he developed? No. And in fact, he and I didn't discuss any of that.
January of 1980, the competition had really picked up.
We watched very carefully the scoops, if you will, who had what story first.
I mean, I got up every morning scared to death that I'd been beaten.
And you didn't sleep on a good story. I mean, if you had what you thought was a good story and you were the only one that had it, I mean, you worked on it until it got in the paper.
I mean, I think ordinarily, all things being equal, competition between two newspapers in any town is to be desired. I think that's a good thing. I think the reader is generally the winner.
We both had people that went to the Public Service Commission every day. We checked the PSC every day. My guess is that nowadays there isn't a reporter drops by over there once every 2 months. But it was that type of competition.
And really the readers did benefit, I think, in the long run. I mean, if the reporting was a little sloppy, it wasn't that bad, and it was better than if it had been a one-paper town.
I mean, everything that moved, you covered.
It is a axiom on the part of many people that the competition was good for the readers.
The newsroom competition was a very insular culture in which instead of trying to serve the reader, you're trying to keep up with or beat the other guy.
But we also had a lot of people in a big hurry, and you had to get that story done that day, and there's somebody else banging on all the same doors.
And instead of thinking about how to do a good piece of reporting, expository or explanatory reporting on an issue, you're thinking, what are they going to have tomorrow? How are they going to handle it? What do we need to have so that the editor doesn't chew me out for getting scooped?
I think we got more coverage quicker, but there was more room for mistakes.
We were telling ourselves, boy, all this news copy we're producing every day, all of this wide open space for reporting, we must be really doing some kick-ass newspapering, but we really weren't.
The journalist in me hates to say it. I think you can have too much news hole where you have no judgment, right? You just spew everything out there, and it becomes this just indecipherable mess.
So did the readers benefit? They probably had more comics.
And readers weren't really especially well served. We were sort of the best representation of it is that for a couple of years, each paper would do a house ad each morning telling what they had the day before that the other paper didn't have. And that became our guideline.
Did they know more about what was going on in the world because of the newspaper war? I don't think so.
Nobody won any Pulitzer Prizes during that time. I don't think anybody got to be a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize during that time.
Between 79 and 1984, or 86, I can't remember which, our revenues went from 5 million to 21 million. I mean, it was phenomenal.
What did happen over the 10-year period was the Democrat became a dramatically better newspaper.
You know, I think that it'd be interesting to hear what the folks at the Gazette said, but I think that really demoralized them. I think they thought, you know, here it was, 1977, these guys were about out of business. We could have struck this deal. We could have had 90% of the profits in the market. And they tried this unbelievably, you know, kind of Hail Mary pass that no one thought would work. It's worked, and now, look, they're making money. Now that they're making money, they'll never go away.
It went from a paper with no advertising and no news to a lot of both. That made them a very serious contender.
The Gazette, then still owned by the Pattersons, sued the Democrat, claiming unfair competitive practices, a lawsuit that the Gazette ultimately lost.
Hugh Patterson's profits slowly but steadily eroded.
The Patterson family, which owned the Gazette, basically that was their only business enterprise. And what happened was you had Mr. Hussman, who also had radio stations, cable television stations, etc., that he was able to use the profits from those operations to underwrite the losses at the Democrat.
Well, it struck me at the time as clearly illegal. A federal court jury disagreed with me.
I think the feeling in the family was that they were thinking of the paper more as an estate than a newspaper, which is a radical departure from the philosophy of the past.
It was a fairly drastic maneuver to go into federal court and accuse your competitor of antitrust violations, particularly when you were still making some money.
The printer's ink in the veins can grow pretty thin. And the Gazette was not the same paper. It was becoming a different kind of paper.
I think the antitrust suit was basically an attempt to regain, through litigation, what they had lost in the marketplace.
The only choice was a civil suit. So we filed that and to try to get a civil relief from the predatory pricing practices.
He had what is, by any lights, an illegal tying arrangement that forced circulation of the Democrat to all their 18,000 subscribers in Hot Springs. To give away advertising is a pretty amazing competitive stand. The giveaway circulation, the same sorts of things, but a jury considered all these things and said, no, it doesn't violate the antitrust law.
Well, desperation implies panic, and there was no panic. But there was the very hard, sober realization that the Hussman's economic resources could go on a lot longer than we could.
But he could see a day when eventually he'd be losing money, and he had no other businesses to back him up as Walter Hussman did.
The beginning of the end was probably the lawsuit, frankly, the loss of the lawsuit.
But I remember I had to just go take a walk because I thought this is not good.
There must have been half a dozen limos parked in the front, right at the front door of the Gazette building, blocking the street, tying up the traffic, and it was the Gannett folks coming in from Virginia.
The Gannett Corporation was chosen because of assurances they gave that they wanted to legitimize themselves and to have newspapers that they could be proud of and could let be run as journalistic organizations.
We'd never had Wingo Zingo games, and we had never had build circulation at all costs, because that is so expensive to do that. When Gannett bought the paper, it was circulation at all costs. It's a circulation war. Get the circulation anywhere you can, get as much as you can, get as big a lead over the other guy, and then he'll capitulate. And so we realized the game changed when Gannett bought the paper.
From the outside looking in, you would have thought that Gannett had a lock. I mean, that they should win the battle. And
There was an attitude when they came in that, boy, how did you all screw this up, and aren't you glad we're here to get you out of it?
Despite the assurances that we'd received of keeping our independence and that sort of thing, they came in and tried to influence every single aspect of it.
Well, the staff was a little apprehensive because it was a change of ownership, and we expected that would mean changes in our lives.
they came in with a formula, which they wished to impose on the paper, which was so contrary to what the Gazette had been, because it had such a strong tradition as a gray old lady, as a sort of sober-minded, newspaper of record.
It's the classic case where you're absorbed by the corporation and they say, we're only here to help you and you're doing great and we're going to let you do it. That's almost never the case, and it wasn't the case here.
Arkansas is a status quo kind of state. Gannett came in and made a lot of changes rapidly to a paper that people had grown accustomed to over many, many generations in the same family. And change is always wrenching.
We were just left bewildered. I mean, it was just, what are these people doing? And as it turned out, I think, I'm not sure they knew. I don't think they ever knew what they were getting into.
I was open to change. I thought color photography was going to be part of the American journalism scene, and I didn't think we'd tarted up the Arkansas Gazette by running color photographs.
But I don't think they ever understood the Gazette's name. I don't think they understood its role as an institution in this state. I don't think they realized what they had purchased.
I had some great differences with Gannett on some things. They really wanted to de-emphasize government coverage. I didn't find government coverage boring. I thought it was an important part of the package, and I fought them on that.
I don't think it occurred to them that they would fail. I don't think it occurred to them that they weren't good enough to compete against these little arky newspapers,
Gannett went through these wild oscillations trying to decide what they wanted to make the Gazette into.
They also really, really underestimated the intelligence and sophistication of the Arkansas newspaper readers.
Mainly because we felt like in some ways they were cheapening the Gazette, running the institution, not upholding the paper's good name, trivializing the news and its role.
They tried to make it a sort of mindless bubblegum type publication.
It exacerbated this idea among Gazette loyalists that Gannett is screwing up my paper.
Gannett was trying to turn a very respectable, very good newspaper into USA Today, and the people of Arkansas didn't like it at all.
There was an attempt to reshape the front page so that there would be one large headline which could be read from the box. If you were in your car and you looked over at a newspaper box at the corner while you were at a street light, you'd be able to read the headline.
Nothing worked. They just kept shooting themselves in the foot.
We sort of had these end-of-the-world headlines on stories that didn't justify it, all in an attempt to sell the paper.
I think it's fair to say they grossly underestimated Walter Hussman.
And people became sort of resistant and hostile toward Gannett in some ways. Some people did.
It might have all been different if they had found some other national chain to buy the paper, frankly.
I think it was one war with two fronts. Ultimately, the business side was more critical. I think that's true.
There was a story, or maybe even a couple of stories, in the business section that angered the management at Dillard's, and they basically pulled their ads out of the paper.
We ran the story about a Dillard's accounting problem that caused us to lose their advertising, a story that the Democrat wouldn't touch.
The Gannett people came in, and in trying to run the advertising department, did not stick with a strict rate card that said the biggest advertiser gets the smallest price per unit. And that was definitely Dillard's at that time.
Dillard's is their biggest advertiser. They're selling advertising to Jimmy Karam, men's store, a very small advertiser, for less than Dillard's is paying.
In order to attract new advertisers particularly, they would give rates to smaller advertisers that were indeed lower than Dillard's rates.
And we showed that to Dillard's, and Dillard's was justifiably concerned about it. Gannett came in, they denied they had done what they were doing. That made Dillard's even more suspicious and about what Gannett was doing.
For whatever reason, Dillard's did drop the Gazette from its advertising mix, and that was a devastating blow because they were by far the biggest advertiser in the market.
Clearly, a major advertiser, and when you're already in the red, the last thing you need to do is lose major advertisers.
One thing John Roberts started was a critique every day, and I got those in the mail. If you had a good story, it was mentioned. If you got beat, it was mentioned. And everybody at the paper got them, all the reporters and editors got them, and you wanted to look good in the critiques because all your peers are reading those. So they really had a good impact.
I said, I want, before you come to work in the morning, I want you to read the Gazette, I want you to read the Democrat, I want you to write a critique about what we did right and what we did wrong and what they did right and what they did wrong. And I want you to circulate the whole thing to the staff at the Democrat. They get daily feedback.
They made him very visible. They made him sort of the front man to kind of distract everybody from all these economic moves that were being made.
And it was amazing the reputation that we developed.
I mean, it was a more of an in-your-face kind of paper, the working man's blue-collar kind of newspaper, as opposed to the Gazette, which always, took this white-collar, distinctive air.
And a lot of it was because of Bob that I never dreamed that this would happen.
John R. Starr made the war about him versus us.
John Robert Starr, petty, a smart aleck, intellectually dishonest, but good at what he did.
And I remember when Bob wrote his first column, I walked over to his office that day and said, Bob, this is a good idea, write an occasional column, especially, if you kind of focus on the newspaper business. A lot of people don't understand the newspaper business, write about First Amendment issues, why we file freedom of information request. That would really help the public understand. Well, obviously, I didn't have a clue as what he was really thinking. He was thinking he was going to write some column that was going to be, about politics, society, sports, economics, and he was going to develop a reputation, which he did.
As people got to personalizing the newspaper with John Robert Starr.
The biggest egomaniac I think I've ever known.
I think he clearly helped Hussman win the war.
Irresponsible.
I'm not going to say he didn't have some success from a marketing point of view, being the person he was.
Underhanded.
Unfortunately, when Gannett came in and made it a big money game, then it became necessary that one newspaper failed. If one newspaper had to fail, I'm glad it was theirs and not ours.
Not a good journalist.
And mounting ad hominem attacks on everything from people's weight to their singing voices, which were among the things that Starr did to try and get a rise out of the Gazette. We stuck to the business of putting out a newspaper.
They knew the Arkansas readers much better than the Gannett people did.
I looked forward to every day to getting out to see where we had beat them and where they had beat us, and to spend the day trying to figure out and make sure they didn't beat us again on anything. That was fun. Just putting out the newspaper is not fun.
We didn't sink to Starr's level.
The rumors that that Gannett and Hussman had reached a deal started like months before.
We knew from the beginning nobody was deluded. We knew the chances were slim to none.
I had folks in the business community sort of prodding me to look into an employee buyout.
And I said, we have to do something, something.
We began calling people on the Gannett board to see if they could slow down the sale.
And we didn't want to try and do it just to throw a monkey wrench in the sale between Gannett and the Democrat. We didn't want to raise expectations and get folks' hopes up if we didn't think there was at least some chance that we could actually pull it off.
I think I sort of got everybody agitated and worked up because we were all sort of resigned to it.
It was a very emotional time, and feelings were running high on both sides.
We wanted to cause a hiccup, if nothing else. We didn't want the Gazette to pass out of existence without a fight.
They were people who believed it was more than self-interest. It was a belief that it would be better for the city and the state if the Gazette survived and the Democrats survived. I still believe that.
At least the effort gave us something to rally around rather than just sitting around waiting for them to shut the doors. It was at least something that sort of pulled people together, gave them a sense of purpose and hope. It was incredible.
I mean, if a miracle had happened, that would have been great. But it would have taken a miracle.
It was a candlelight vigil that night. It was quite a time.
Little old ladies who lived next to my parents in Smackover, Arkansas were saying, what can we do? Can we send them $10 to try to save the paper?
There were rallies in the process, and T-shirts were made, and we rallied public support in a lot of different ways.
And I think we were all, to a certain extent, driven by love for the paper.
It left a feeling that the town had lost something by the Gazette's closure, which I certainly believe.
The closing of the Gazette was also a high point in terms of the people. I've never worked any place with so many good people. I mean,
It really took the steam, it took the pleasure out of the victory for some people of the Democrat Gazette. Now, I know they were happy to win, but I know that Starr, to his death, never felt like they had really gotten the credit they deserved for winning, that there was too much attention given to the people who lost. Hussman, in the face of everything they could throw at him, still wasn't going to quit. And they went to see him and said, either you buy us or we'll buy you. And he said, I'll buy you.
The Gannett Company permanently suspended publishing operations of the Arkansas Gazette. Effective tomorrow, the first edition of the Arkansas Democrat Gazette will be published.
Toward the end, I think Walter Hussman understood the Gazette as an institution better than its owners did.
I think we don't yet know what the loss of the Gazette will mean in Arkansas. I think the loss of a moderating voice has its impact in subtle ways we can't always immediately see.
My lifelong ambition was to own a really profitable, solid, good newspaper, and the largest newspaper in Arkansas.
What won the newspaper war was a very, very rich man, Walter Hussman, with very, very deep pockets, who spent, probably counting the amount he eventually paid for the paper, somewhere near $250 million to buy this market. That's what newspapers are about. You know, you don't worry too much about a mistake you made yesterday. You try and get a better story tomorrow.